The grave robbers found bones in Bolivia. The DNA proved they dug up the wrong outlaw. For over a century, history books have told us exactly where Butch Cassidy is buried. They say he lies in a nameless grave in Bolivia, riddled with bullets from a 1908 shootout. The story goes that the most wanted outlaw in America finally ran out of luck in a dusty mining town called San Vicente, trapped by the Bolivian army with his partner, the Sundance Kid. 2 shots rang out from inside that adobe house. And when the soldiers cautiously entered the next morning, they found 2 dead Americans. Case closed. History written. The legend of Butch Cassidy ended in blood and gunpowder at 15,000 feet in the Andes Mountains. But in 1991, a forensic team finally dug up that grave to prove it once and for all. What they found didn't just rewrite history, it shattered it. Because when the DNA results came back, they revealed something nobody expected, something that made every textbook, every documentary, and every historian rethink everything they thought they knew. The man in that Bolivian grave wasn't Butch Cassidy, it wasn't even close. And if Butch Cassidy isn't buried in Bolivia, then the biggest question in Wild West history suddenly becomes a whole lot more interesting. Where did he really go? And more importantly, how did he get away with it? How did America's most wanted outlaw simply vanish from the face of the earth and stay hidden for over a century? Let me tell you the story that science finally proved. This is the case file on the Cassidy DNA mystery, and it changes everything we thought we knew about America's most charming outlaw. The official story that never made sense. The official version of Butch Cassidy's death has been repeated in textbooks and movies for decades. It's clean. It's dramatic. It's the kind of ending that legends deserve. On November 4, 1908, a mining company courier named Carlos Perot was traveling through the desolate highlands of southern Bolivia when 2 masked Americans ambushed him. They took the company payroll, worth about $90,000 in today's money, and disappeared into the rocky landscape. 3 days later, on November 6th, Bolivian authorities cornered a pair of Americans matching the bandits' description in a rented house in San Vicente. The lawmen surrounded the building and called for surrender. Instead, they got a shootout. When a Bolivian soldier approached the house, the Americans shot him dead. A brief exchange of gunfire followed. Then the mayor of San Vicente, a man named Clyde, reported hearing 3 screams of desperation from inside the house. Then came 2 single gunshots, one right after the other. The authorities waited until morning to enter, fearing a trap. When they finally went in, they found 2 dead foreigners. As one man was slumped against a wall with bullet wounds to his body and a gunshot to his forehead. The other appeared to have shot his partner, then turned the gun on himself. The courier, Carlos Perot, was brought in to identify the bodies. He confirmed these were the men who had robbed him, though all he had ever really seen of them were their eyes behind those bandanas. The local authorities concluded that the dead men were the notorious American outlaws Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. They buried them in unmarked graves in the village cemetery and considered the matter settled. But here's the problem with that story. Nobody in San Vicente actually knew what Butch Cassidy looked like. The Pinkerton Detective Agency had been warning banks across South America about 2 American outlaws who matched the general description. But that's all anyone had to go on. General descriptions, vague warnings, nothing concrete. The bodies were never photographed. No positive identification was ever made. They just buried 2 dead gringos and called them Butch and Sundance because it made sense at the time, because it was convenient, because closing a case is always easier than keeping it open. And almost immediately, the doubts started. When news of the San Vicente shootout made its way back to the United States, Butch's friends and family didn't believe it, not for a second. William Pinkerton himself, a head of the famous detective agency that had been chasing Cassidy for years, dismissed the whole story as a fake. The Pinkerton Agency never officially closed their file on Butch Cassidy. They kept looking. Why would they keep looking if they believed he was dead? The sightings that wouldn't stop. Sightings of Butch Cassidy, began pouring in almost immediately after his supposed death. People claimed to have seen him in Wyoming, in Utah, in Nevada. His own sister, Lula Parker Bettinson, would later write that he came home to visit the family in Circleville, Utah in 1925, driving a Ford and full of regrets for disappointing his mother. She quoted him as saying, "All I did is make a wreck of my life." Residents of Cassidy's hometown swore they recognized him working in Nevada years after he supposedly died in Bolivia. They described his mannerisms, his walk, his way of talking. They said it was him. No doubt. But these were just stories, memories, hearsay, without proof. And historians stuck with the official version because it was cleaner, simpler. 2 outlaws died in a shootout. The end. That's how legends are supposed to work. Neat endings, closed cases, no loose ends. Until 1991, when technology finally caught up to the mystery. The exhumation that changed everything. A husband and wife research team named Daniel Buck and Ann Meadows had spent years tracking down the truth about Butch and Sundance. They combed through South American archives. They studied Bolivian police reports. They traced every document they could find about the San Vicente shootout. And while the paper trail seemed to point toward the outlaws dying in Bolivia, they knew the only way to settle this once and for all was to find out who was actually in those graves. So they enlisted the help of Clyde Snow, one of the world's most renowned forensic anthropologists. This was the same scientist who had positively identified the remains of Nazi war criminal Joseph Mengele. If anyone could solve the Butch Cassidy mystery, it was him. They got permission from Bolivian authorities to exhume the bodies, and in 1991 they headed to San Vicente with shovels and hope. An elderly villager whose father had reportedly witnessed the original shootout guided them to the gravesite. The team began to dig. And despite the high winds that locals interpreted as the souls of the dead protesting the disturbance, they kept digging. What they found was one complete skeleton and fragments of another, including part of a skull. The bones looked promising. The skeleton's height matched what was known about Butch Cassidy. The estimated age of death lined up. On the surface, it looked like case closed. They had found him. But Clyde Snow wasn't interested in surface appearances. He was interested in science. They carefully transported the remains and prepared for the real test, the one that would settle this mystery forever. They ran DNA analysis on the bones, comparing them to living relatives of Robert LeRoy Parker, Butch Cassidy's real name. Neither Butch nor Sundance had children, so the researchers used distant relatives for the comparison. Cousins, second cousins, people who shared the Parker family line. Everyone expected confirmation. Everyone expected the DNA to match. To finally prove that the legend died in that Bolivian shootout, just like the history book said. That's not what happened. The DNA results came back with a clear answer. No match. The skeleton in that grave was not related to the Parker family. It wasn't Butch Cassidy. Further investigation revealed that the exact location of the grave was only known within an accuracy of several yards. And the body they dug up was most likely that of Gustav Zimmer, a German miner who had died around the same time. The wrong man had been lying in Butch Cassidy's supposed grave for over 80 years. Think about what this means. If Butch Cassidy isn't in that grave, then who did the Bolivian army kill on November 7, 1908? Were they even Americans? Were they outlaws at all? Or just 2 unfortunate foreigners in the wrong place at the wrong time who got caught up in a manhunt they didn't deserve? And the even bigger question, if Butch Cassidy didn't die in Bolivia, where did he go? Science had just proved the history books wrong. But it couldn't tell us what really happened. That's where the story gets even more interesting. The man who appeared out of thin air. There was another man. A man who showed up in Spokane, Washington in the early 1900s and lived a quiet life as a machinist. His name was William T Phillips. And according to people who knew him, he had a secret. William T. Phillips first appeared in the public record in 1908, the same year as the San Vicente shootout. He married a woman named Gertrude Livesay in Adrian, Michigan in May of that year. Before 1908, there's almost no trace of Phillips anywhere. It's like he materialized out of thin air and started a brand new life with a brand new name. The couple moved to Spokane in 1911, where Phillips opened a machine shop and became a respected businessman. He was married. He had an adopted son. That he belonged to the Elks Lodge. On paper, William T. Phillips was exactly what he appeared to be, a hard-working American who ran a legitimate business and contributed to his community. But Phillips had told some of his closest friends something remarkable. He claimed he was actually Butch Cassidy. At first, nobody outside of Spokane knew about these claims. But in the 1930s, Phillips did something that caught people's attention. He traveled back to Wyoming, specifically to the area around Lander, and he spent the summer of 1934 camping out in the Wind River Range. He told stories about the Wild Bunch. He knew details about outlaw hideouts that weren't in any history books. He dug holes in remote locations, supposedly looking for buried loot he had stashed decades earlier. And here's the remarkable part. Multiple people in Lander recognized him. These weren't gullible tourists or people who wanted to believe a good story. These were ranchers, business people, pillars of the community who had actually known Butch Cassidy back in his outlaw days. One of them was even one of Cassidy's old girlfriends, and they all swore this man Phillips was Butch Cassidy himself. Could they all have been fooled? That's what skeptics argued. They said Phillips was just a faker who had learned enough about Butch's life to convince people who wanted to believe. But the people who met Phillips in Wyoming in 1934 weren't easy marks. They were sharp, practical folks who had actually run in outlaw circles. If anyone could spot a fake Butch Cassidy, it would be them. The manuscript that gave him away. Phillips also wrote a manuscript titled The Bandit Invincible, the story of Butch Cassidy. On the surface, it was presented as a biography, but people who read it noticed something strange. The details were too specific. The personal anecdotes were too intimate. It read less like someone writing about Butch Cassidy and more like someone writing their own memoir under a thin veil of fiction. The manuscript described things that only someone who had actually lived that life would know. Obscure outlaw hideouts that law enforcement had never discovered. Personal relationships between gang members that were never documented anywhere else. One particularly telling detail involved a canyon hideout used by a rustler named Edward Cuddy in the 1890s. And Phillips wrote about how you needed a guide who knew the entire country or you'd never find the place. Records later confirmed that Edward Cuddy had actually been imprisoned in the Wyoming Territorial Prison at the same time as Butch Cassidy. That's not the kind of detail you pick up from reading newspaper articles. Physically, Phillips bore a strong resemblance to known photographs of Butch Cassidy. They were both medium-built men, around 5 feet 8 inches tall, with similar facial features. And according to people who claimed to have examined Phillips closely, he had scars that matched injuries Cassidy was known to have suffered, but perhaps the most compelling evidence came from Phillips himself. According to his adopted son, William R. Phillips, his stepfather explicitly told him he was Butch Cassidy. This wasn't a deathbed confession or a drunken boast. It was a matter-of-fact revelation from a father to his son, and William R. Phillips believed it for the rest of his life. And Phillips died of cancer in Spokane in 1937. He was cremated, which meant that any chance of using DNA to prove his identity died with him. His wife, Gertrude, later told a Cassidy researcher that her husband had known Butch, but wasn't actually him. But Phillips's son believed she only said that because she didn't want the notoriety. She wanted to protect her husband's secret, even after his death. The timing that makes too much sense. So why would Butch Cassidy, if that's really who Phillips was, keep his identity hidden for so long? The answer might lie in the statute of limitations. Most of the crimes Butch committed would have been prosecuted under state laws with expiration dates. If he could stay hidden long enough, he could eventually come back without fear of arrest. By the time Phillips started openly claiming to be Cassidy in the 1930s, enough time had passed that most of his old crimes couldn't be prosecuted anymore. It would explain why he lived quietly for so many years, as building a legitimate life under an assumed name. It would explain why he only returned to Wyoming decades after the fact, when it was finally safe. And it would explain why he wrote a manuscript about his outlaw days, but never published it. He was telling his story, but carefully, in a way that gave him plausible deniability if anyone came asking questions. The twist that complicates everything. But here's where the story gets complicated. In 2012, a researcher named Larry Pointer, who had spent decades arguing that Phillips was Cassidy, changed his mind. Pointer had discovered new evidence suggesting that William T Phillips was actually another man entirely, a small-time outlaw named William T Wilcox, who had served time in the Wyoming Territorial Prison alongside Butch Cassidy in the 1890s. Pointer found prison records and mugshots showing that Wilcox and Phillips looked remarkably similar, yet he argued that Wilcox had known Cassidy well enough to pick up stories and details during their time in prison together, and that Wilcox later assumed a new identity as Phillips, and either genuinely believed he was Cassidy or deliberately perpetrated an elaborate hoax. Other researchers disagreed. Historians Ann Meadows and Dan Buck conducted their own investigation and concluded that Phillips had never been anywhere near Bolivia, as they suspected he got his information about South American adventures from books and maps at the Spokane Public Library. They called him a hoaxer, plain and simple. But that still leaves questions. How did Phillips, or Wilcox if that's who he really was, know those obscure details about outlaw hideouts and gang dynamics? How did he fool so many people in Wyoming who had actually known Butch Cassidy? Why did multiple reputable citizens swear they recognized him as the real deal? And what about Butch's own sister, who claimed her brother came home years after his supposed death? The scientific truth and the unanswered questions. Here's what we know for certain. Science proved that the man buried in San Vicente, Bolivia, is not Butch Cassidy. The DNA evidence is conclusive on that point. History books that state Butch died in that 1908 shootout are wrong. But science can't tell us what really happened after that. It can't tell us if Butch escaped from Bolivia somehow, or if he was never there in the first place. It can't tell us if William T Phillips was the real Butch Cassidy living under an alias, or if he was just an incredibly convincing imposter who fooled an entire town. It can't tell us why Butch's own family insisted he survived. It can't tell us why the Pinkerton Agency kept their file open. It can't tell us why sightings kept coming for decades after his supposed death. And what the DNA proved is that one of America's greatest outlaw mysteries is still unsolved. The legend didn't end in a hail of bullets at 15,000 feet. It ended somewhere else, in some way we're still trying to figure out. And that might be the most fitting end for Butch Cassidy after all. The man who spent his whole career outsmarting lawmen and disappearing into the wilderness managed to disappear from history itself. The secret, whatever it was, he took to his real grave, wherever that might be. The mystery that won't die. So where does that leave us? If the DNA proved the Bolivian grave wasn't Butch, and if William T Phillips might have been a convincing imposter, but not the real thing, then what happened to Robert LeRoy Parker? Did he die in obscurity somewhere, his real grave still waiting to be discovered? Did he live out his days under another name we haven't even found yet? Did he finally find the peace that always eluded him as an outlaw? The truth is, we may never know. But here's what makes this story so compelling. Butch Cassidy wasn't just a criminal. He was a folk hero, a symbol of resistance against the banks and railroads that were swallowing the American West. People loved him because he robbed the rich and, by most accounts, treated the poor with kindness. He was charming, smart, and almost impossible to catch. For a man like that, disappearing completely might have been the ultimate victory. He outran the Pinkertons, he outran the Bolivian army, and in the end, he outran history itself. Every time we think we've found him, the evidence slips through our fingers. Every time we think we've solved the mystery, another piece appears that doesn't fit. Maybe that's exactly how Butch wanted it. The final question. If you think you've got the Wild West all figured out, Wait until you hear about the other mysteries that historians are still arguing about, the graves that don't contain who they're supposed to, the outlaws who may have escaped justice entirely, the secrets buried with the dead that science can't quite uncover. Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think really happened to Butch Cassidy. Was he William T Phillips, living quietly in Spokane? Did he die in some other shootout we haven't discovered yet? Or did he finally get the peaceful life he never had as an outlaw, passing away as an old man with his identity still intact? The DNA proved one thing for certain: the history books got it wrong. Everything else, still waiting to be solved.